The carpenter repairing the weathered roof of the abandoned Holloway estate in Dusty Creek, Nevada, stopped hammering at noon on September 3, 1862, when his crowbar punched through rotting timber and revealed something that made his blood run cold. Two small skeletons huddled together in a corner of a sealed attic space, surrounded by crude drawings scratched into the wooden walls and rusted chains bolted to the floor beams. What authorities discovered in that forgotten attic would expose how one father's obsession with control and perfection had transformed his own twin sons into prisoners, hidden from society for a decade in complete darkness and isolation. This is the story of the Raymond twins, two boys who were erased from existence at birth and locked away in suffocating heat and bitter cold, simply because their father believed they carried a curse that would destroy his family's reputation. A secret buried beneath decades of silence, finally brought to light by accident, revealing one of the most horrifying cases of parental cruelty in American frontier history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sound of splintering wood echoed across the sun-baked hills surrounding Dusty Creek, Nevada, on that scorching September afternoon in 1862. Carpenter Tristan Boyd had been hired by the new property owners to assess the structural integrity of the Holloway estate, a two-story timber house that had stood empty for nearly 3 years after the previous occupants had vanished without explanation or forwarding address. The work was routine, tedious even, replacing rotted shingles and reinforcing support beams that had weathered too many harsh Nevada winters without proper maintenance. The metallic scrape of his crowbar against wood created a rhythm that had become almost meditative after 6 hours of labor under the relentless sun. Sweat dripped from his brow, leaving dark stains on the weathered planks beneath his boots as he worked methodically across the roofline. The texture of sun-bleached timber felt rough and brittle under his calloused hands, crumbling in places where moisture and insects had done their slow work of destruction over years of neglect. When his crowbar suddenly punched through what should have been solid roofing, Tristan assumed he had found another section compromised by rot. The sharp crack of breaking wood was followed by a rush of stale air that carried a smell he couldn't immediately identify. Something ancient and wrong, like opening a tomb that had been sealed for centuries. The odor made him recoil instinctively, covering his nose with his bandana as he peered into the darkness below. What he saw in that first moment would haunt him for the rest of his life. Two small forms huddled in the corner of what appeared to be a sealed attic space, their bones arranged in a position that suggested they had been embracing when death finally came. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the hole he had created illuminated crude drawings covering every inch of the wooden walls. Pictures of horses, houses, people, and landscapes scratched into the timber with what must have been fingernails, broken glass, or pieces of metal. The artwork of someone who had never been allowed to see the world they were drawing from imagination alone. Tristan descended the ladder with shaking legs and mounted his horse, riding hard toward the sheriff's office in the center of Dusty Creek. The town had grown rapidly during the silver rush of the 1850s, swelling from a handful of prospectors to a proper settlement with a main street, courthouse, and a basic infrastructure required for civilized society. But beneath that veneer of respectability, everyone knew that frontier justice operated according to different rules than the law books suggested, and secrets could be buried as easily as silver ore could be extracted from the surrounding mountains. Sheriff Victor Malone was seated at his desk reviewing land dispute documents when Tristan burst through the door at 1:15, his face pale and his words tumbling out in a rush that made little sense until the carpenter forced himself to slow down and explain what he had discovered. The sheriff's expression shifted from irritation at the interruption to serious concern as he realized this wasn't a minor property dispute or complaint about rowdy prospectors. This was something that would require the coroner, possibly federal marshals, and almost certainly an investigation that would uncover truths some people in Dusty Creek would prefer remain buried. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, a small group had gathered at the Holloway estate. Sheriff Malone, Coroner Dr. Simon Briggs, Deputy Aaron Jennings, and Tristan Boyd stood in the yard, while two men carefully removed sections of the roof to provide access to the sealed attic. The work proceeded slowly, methodically, as everyone present understood they were entering what was effectively a crime scene, though none of them yet understood the full scope of what crimes had been committed within those walls. Dr. Briggs was the first to enter the attic space, lowering himself through the opening with a lantern that cast dancing shadows across walls covered in desperate artwork. The medical man had served as coroner for Dusty Creek since 1856 and had examined bodies recovered from mining accidents, gunfights, disease outbreaks, and every other manner of frontier death. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he found in that sealed space, measuring roughly 12 feet by 15 feet, with a ceiling so low that even a grown man of average height would need to stoop. The skeletons belonged to two young boys, approximately 9 or 10 years old, based on bone development and dental examination. They had been dead for at least 3 years, possibly longer, based on the advanced state of decomposition and the settled dust that covered everything in the space. But what made Dr. Briggs's hands shake as he documented his findings was the evidence that these boys had not died quickly or mercifully. Iron restraints were bolted to the floor beams, sized for small wrists and ankles. A bucket in the corner had served as a primitive toilet, its contents long since dried to a crust that added to the overwhelming stench filling the sealed space. Scraps of fabric suggested bedding of the most basic kind, nothing that would have provided comfort during the freezing Nevada winters when temperatures regularly dropped below zero, or during the brutal summers when the attic would have become an oven that made breathing itself a challenge. The walls told their own story through thousands of scratched drawings. One section showed what appeared to be a family, stick figures holding hands beneath a simple house. Another area depicted horses and cattle, drawn with surprising detail considering the artist had likely never been allowed to approach such animals. A third section showed landscapes with mountains, rivers, and trees, imagination filling in details that direct observation had been denied. But the most disturbing drawings were the ones that showed faces, dozens of faces scratched into the wood with varying levels of skill and detail. Some were crude and simple, while others showed remarkable artistic ability for someone who had never received formal instruction. Dr. Briggs realized these faces represented people the boys had heard but never seen, voices that had filtered through the floorboards from the house below, creating imagined appearances for individuals whose actual faces remained forever unknown. Sheriff Malone joined the coroner in the attic space, his considerable bulk making movement difficult in the confined area. The lawman's weathered face showed no emotion as he examined the scene, but his jaw muscles clenched tight as he took in the evidence of prolonged suffering. He had seen cruelty before. The frontier attracted people who were running from something or someone, and violence was never far from the surface in communities built on the unstable foundation of mineral wealth and territorial ambition. But this was different. This was systematic, planned, and executed with a coldness that spoke to something darker than simple brutality. The iron restraints showed signs of having been professionally installed, not crude improvisation but careful carpentry work that suggested someone with skills and tools had constructed this prison with deliberate intention. The attic had been sealed from the inside of the house, accessible only through a trap door that could be locked from below, ensuring that the occupants had no possibility of escape or even of making their presence known to anyone who might visit the property. Deputy Jennings discovered something that added another layer of horror to the scene. A small box tucked into a corner containing what appeared to be food scraps, dried and preserved by the arid Nevada climate. Examination revealed hard biscuits, strips of dried meat, and desiccated apple cores. The kind of provisions that would keep someone alive but provide no nutrition beyond bare survival. Someone had been feeding the boys imprisoned in this space, climbing up to deliver sustenance at intervals, while ensuring they remained hidden from the world below. The question that haunted everyone present wasn't just who had created this attic prison, but why anyone would choose to lock away two young boys in such conditions rather than simply allowing them to live normal lives, or, if they were unwanted, placing them with relatives or orphanages that could have provided proper care. The answer would emerge from documents discovered hidden within the walls of the house below, papers that revealed a family secret so shameful that a father had chosen to erase his own sons from existence rather than allow the truth about their birth to become public knowledge. But first, the investigation needed to establish the basic facts. Who were these boys? When had they died? And most importantly, where was the father who had last owned this property? a man named Samuel Holloway who had left Dusty Creek in the winter of 1859 without explanation and had never been seen in Nevada Territory again. The Holloway family had arrived in Dusty Creek during the summer of 1849, part of the Great Western Migration that had transformed Nevada Territory from empty desert into a landscape dotted with mining camps, trading posts, and settlements that aspired to become proper towns. Samuel Holloway had been 32 years old when he staked his claim on a promising section of land 3 miles outside what would become Dusty Creek's main settlement, bringing with him his wife Cora and their infant daughter Piper. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Holloway estate had been constructed over the course of 2 years, built with timber hauled from the Sierra Nevada mountains, and designed according to plans that Samuel had brought from his previous life in Missouri. The house was substantial by frontier standards, 2 full stories with a pitched roof and a stone foundation that suggested permanence and prosperity. Samuel had invested heavily in the property, installing glass windows shipped at great expense from San Francisco, constructing a barn capable of housing a dozen horses, and establishing irrigation systems that allowed him to cultivate a modest garden despite the harsh desert climate. Samuel Holloway had not been a miner, like most men who came west during the Silver Rush. His wealth came from more reliable sources, supplying goods and services to the prospectors who flooded into Nevada Territory with dreams of striking it rich. He operated a general store in Dusty Creek's growing commercial district, maintained a freight business that hauled supplies from California to Nevada mining camps, and owned several rental properties that housed the constant stream of newcomers seeking their fortune in the silver-rich mountains. By 1852, Samuel Holloway had become one of Dusty Creek's most prominent citizens, respected for his business acumen and his willingness to extend credit to struggling prospectors who would remember his generosity once their claims started producing. He served on the town council, contributed generously to the construction of Dusty Creek's first church, and was frequently mentioned in the local newspaper as an exemplar of frontier entrepreneurship and civic responsibility. Cora Holloway had been equally prominent in the community's social circles, organizing charitable events, teaching Sunday school, and serving as an informal advisor to newly arrived families who needed guidance navigating the challenges of frontier life. Contemporary accounts described her as a handsome woman of strong character and refined sensibilities, someone who maintained standards of civilized behavior despite living in a region where such standards were frequently ignored or dismissed as Eastern affectation. The couple's daughter Piper had grown up as a beloved figure in Dusty Creek society, receiving private tutoring from educated immigrants who supplemented their income by teaching the offspring of wealthy families. By all accounts, she was an intelligent and charming young woman who seemed destined for a prosperous marriage to someone of appropriate social standing, perhaps one of the successful mine owners or merchants who formed the upper tier of frontier society. But in March of 1852, everything changed for the Holloway family in ways that would eventually lead to the attic prison that Tristan Boyd would discover a decade later. Cora Holloway gave birth to twin boys at the family estate, delivered by Dr. Nathan Collins, the same physician who had attended to most of Dusty Creek's medical needs since establishing his practice in 1850. The births were not announced in the local newspaper, which was unusual for a family as prominent as the Holloways. No celebration was held, no congratulatory visits were made by friends and business associates, who would normally mark such an occasion with gifts and well wishes. The absence of any public acknowledgement was noted by some members of the community, but frontier society operated according to an unspoken code that respected privacy and discouraged excessive curiosity about matters families chose to keep private. What the community didn't know was that something about the twins' birth had convinced Samuel Holloway that his sons represented a threat to everything he had built in Nevada Territory. The exact nature of this perceived threat would remain unclear until investigators discovered Samuel's private journals years later, but the consequences were immediate and absolute. The twins were hidden away in the attic space that had been specifically constructed for their imprisonment, and the Holloway family continued their public lives as though the boys had never been born. Dr. Collins had been paid handsomely for his discretion regarding the twins' existence, receiving regular monthly payments that supplemented his medical practice income and ensured his silence about the unusual circumstances of their birth and subsequent disappearance from all official records. The arrangement had been formalized through written agreements discovered later among the doctor's personal papers, documents that outlined his responsibilities for providing ongoing medical care to the hidden boys while maintaining absolute confidentiality about their existence. The births had been recorded in Dr. Collins's private medical ledger, entries that identified the twins as Samuel Holloway Jr. and Thomas Holloway, born March 14, 1852, both appearing healthy with normal development and no obvious physical abnormalities. But these entries had been deliberately omitted from the official birth registry maintained by the territorial government, ensuring that no legal record existed to prove the boys had ever been born. Sheriff Malone's investigation would later reveal that Samuel had paid additional bribes to the clerk responsible for maintaining birth records, ensuring that the twins' existence remained completely undocumented in any official capacity. The systematic erasure of the boys from legal existence had required careful planning and the cooperation of multiple individuals who were willing to compromise their professional ethics in exchange for financial compensation. The Holloway family had continued their normal routines after the twins' birth, maintaining their prominent position in Dusty Creek society while secretly imprisoning 2 young boys in the sealed attic of their estate. Samuel continued operating his businesses. Cora maintained her social activities, and Piper attended her tutoring sessions without any outward indication that anything had changed in their family circumstances. But those who knew the family well noticed subtle changes. Cora became more withdrawn, spending less time on social activities and more time at the family estate. Samuel grew irritable and short-tempered, particularly when business matters required his attention away from home for extended periods. The couple's relationship appeared strained, though such tensions were not uncommon in frontier marriages, where the pressures of building prosperity in harsh conditions took their toll on even the strongest partnerships. The question that would haunt investigators was how Samuel and Cora had justified their actions to themselves. How did parents wake each morning and go about their daily lives while knowing their own sons were locked in darkness above their heads, dependent entirely on whatever minimal care their captors chose to provide? What kind of perceived threat or shame could possibly justify such systematic cruelty toward helpless boys who had committed no crime beyond being born? The answer would emerge from documents hidden within the walls of the Holloway estate, papers that revealed a secret so carefully guarded that Samuel had been willing to destroy his own sons rather than allow the truth to become known. But before investigators could uncover those documents, they needed to trace what had happened to the Holloway family after they abandoned their estate in the winter of 1859, leaving behind the bodies of 2 boys who had spent their entire lives as prisoners in their own home. Sheriff Victor Malone established his investigation headquarters in the Holloway estate's main parlor, a room that still contained much of the original furniture despite 3 years of abandonment. Dust covered everything like a burial shroud, and the musty smell of decay mixed with the dry scent of aged wood as he spread maps and documents across a table that had once hosted dinner parties and social gatherings for Dusty Creek's elite families. Holloway. The texture of yellowed paper crinkled under his calloused fingers as he reviewed property records, business licenses, and correspondence that painted a picture of the Holloway family's life before their disappearance. Deputy Jennings had spent 2 days collecting documents from various sources: the land office, the courthouse, the newspaper archives, and the private papers of merchants who had conducted business with Samuel Holloway during his years in Nevada Territory. The investigation faced immediate challenges that were unique to frontier society. Record-keeping was inconsistent at best, with many transactions conducted on handshake agreements rather than formal contracts. People came and went without leaving forwarding addresses, and the constant movement of population meant that witnesses to events from a decade earlier might be scattered across a dozen different territories, or dead from disease, accident, or violence that claimed lives with depressing regularity in the American West. But Malone had been a lawman for 15 years. First as a deputy in Texas and then as sheriff of Dusty Creek since 1858, and he understood how to reconstruct the past from fragmentary evidence. Every transaction left traces, every interaction created memories, and patient investigation could assemble a coherent narrative from seemingly unconnected pieces of information. The first breakthrough came from examining financial records maintained by the Dusty Creek Bank and Trust, an institution that had served the community since 1851 and maintained meticulous documentation of deposits, withdrawals, and loans. Samuel Holloway had been a regular customer, and his banking activities revealed patterns that suggested careful financial planning and substantial ongoing expenses that couldn't be explained by his documented business operations and household needs. Monthly withdrawals of $50 in cash had occurred with clockwork regularity from April 1852 through December 1859, amounts that represented significant sums in an era when a skilled laborer might earn $30 per month. The withdrawals were always made in person by Samuel himself, always in cash, and always without any documented business purpose that would justify such regular large expenses. Bank President Cooper Ellis, who had known Samuel Holloway personally and had approved several of his business loans, remembered the monthly withdrawals but had never questioned their purpose. Frontier banking operated on trust and discretion, and customers were not required to explain how they spent their own money as long as their accounts remained in good standing. But when Sheriff Malone showed Ellis the evidence from the attic prison, the banker's expression shifted from professional courtesy to genuine shock. He had considered Samuel Holloway a friend and business partner, someone whose word was reliable and whose character seemed above reproach. The revelation that this respected merchant had been systematically imprisoning and possibly murdering his own sons created a cognitive dissonance that Ellis struggled to reconcile with his memories of the man. The monthly withdrawals corresponded exactly with payments made to Dr. Collins for what the physician's records described as ongoing medical consultations. The doctor's private ledger, obtained through a court order after his death in 1860, showed regular visits to the Holloway estate to provide medical care to unnamed patients whose conditions were never specified, but who required monthly examinations and occasional treatment for ailments including malnutrition, respiratory infections, and what Dr. Collins had euphemistically described as adjustment difficulties. Dr. Collins had maintained two entirely separate sets of medical records, Sheriff Malone discovered. The official records that were available for public inspection showed routine care for the Holloway family, minor injuries, seasonal illnesses, and the normal health maintenance expected for a frontier household. But the private ledger revealed another category of patients identified only by numbers rather than names, individuals who received care that was documented with clinical precision, but without any identifying information that would connect them to specific people or families. Patient 1 and Patient 2 in Dr. Collins's private ledger had been seen monthly from April 1852 through their final entries in November 1859. The medical notes described boys who suffered from chronic malnutrition despite receiving what the doctor considered adequate caloric intake. They experienced repeated respiratory infections that he attributed to poor ventilation and temperature extremes. They showed signs of psychological deterioration that manifested in withdrawal, repetitive behaviors, and what Dr. Collins described as profound melancholy inconsistent with their age. The doctor had prescribed various treatments over the years, though his notes suggested frustration with the limitations imposed by their living conditions. He had recommended increased food rations, better ventilation, exposure to sunlight, and social interaction with other people, all suggestions that appeared to have been ignored by whoever was responsible for the boys' care. His final entries in November 1859 noted that both patients were showing signs of severe decline and would likely not survive another winter without significant improvements to their living conditions. But the most damning evidence in Dr. Collins's records was a letter he had written to Samuel Holloway in October 1859, discovered tucked into the private ledger pages. The letter represented the doctor's attempt to convince Samuel that continuing to imprison the boys was both medically dangerous and morally indefensible, though the language was carefully crafted to avoid explicitly stating what was being done to them. The letter read in part, "I must again express my grave concerns regarding the ongoing situation with the two subjects under your supervision. Their physical condition continues to deteriorate despite my best efforts to provide adequate medical care within the constraints you have established. The psychological damage from their prolonged isolation has become severe and likely irreversible. I strongly recommend that alternative arrangements be made immediately, as I can no longer in good conscience continue providing care under the current circumstances. If changes are not made, I must withdraw from this engagement and can accept no responsibility for the consequences that will inevitably follow." Samuel's response, if he had made one, was not preserved in Dr. Collins's records, but the timing suggested that the letter had prompted decisive action. The Holloway family had left Dusty Creek in December 1859, less than 2 months after Dr. Collins had threatened to withdraw his cooperation with their imprisonment scheme. They had departed suddenly, without selling their property or settling their business affairs, leaving behind significant assets and unanswered questions about their destination. Sheriff Malone interviewed everyone in Dusty Creek who remembered the Holloway family's departure, though after 3 years most memories had faded and been replaced by speculation and rumor. The general consensus was that Samuel had received news of a business opportunity in California and had decided to relocate quickly to take advantage of favorable circumstances. Some remembered that Cora had seemed reluctant to leave, and that Piper had been distressed about abandoning friends and familiar surroundings. But no one had thought the departure was particularly suspicious at the time, as such sudden relocations were common in a region where people followed opportunity wherever it might lead. What no one had known was that Samuel Holloway was fleeing not toward opportunity but away from the consequences of his crimes. He had left behind 2 dying boys locked in an attic, calculating that by the time their bodies were discovered, if they ever were, he would be safely beyond the reach of territorial law enforcement. The investigation now focused on 2 primary questions. What had motivated Samuel to imprison his own sons for their entire lives? And where had the Holloway family gone after leaving Nevada Territory? The answer to the first question would come from documents hidden within the estate's walls. The answer to the second would require cooperation from law enforcement agencies across multiple territories and states. A coordination effort that would reveal the Holloway case was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of family secrets and systematic cruelty that extended far beyond the borders of Nevada Territory. The discovery of Samuel Holloway's hidden documents occurred on September 10, 1862, exactly 1 week after Tristan Boyd had accidentally broken through the sealed attic. Deputy Jennings had been conducting a methodical search of the estate's interior when he noticed irregularities in the parlor's wooden paneling, sections that seemed slightly recessed compared to the surrounding wall surface. The texture of the wood felt different under his probing fingers, and when he applied pressure to one particular section, the concealed door swung inward to reveal a narrow cavity built into the wall between structural supports. The hiding place contained a leather satchel sealed with wax and protected from moisture by layers of oilcloth wrapping. Inside the satchel were 3 items that would explain everything. Samuel Holloway's private journal spanning the years 1850 to 1859, a collection of letters exchanged between Samuel and various correspondents, and a series of daguerreotype photographs that documented the twins at various stages of their imprisonment. 18 Followways. Sheriff Malone handled the journal with careful reverence, understanding that he was holding evidence of crimes that transcended ordinary frontier violence and entered territory that challenged fundamental assumptions about parental love and family obligation. The musty smell of aged leather mixed with the metallic scent of old ink as he carefully turned pages that had been written in Samuel's precise, methodical handwriting. Each entry was dated and organized with the attention to detail one would expect from a successful merchant who built his fortune on careful record-keeping. The journal opened with an entry dated March 15, 1852, written the day after the twins were born. The words revealed a father confronting what he considered a catastrophe that threatened to destroy everything he had built in Nevada Territory. Samuel wrote with clinical detachment about the circumstances of the birth and the terrible choice he believed he faced. The entry read, "Cora delivered twin sons yesterday evening. Dr. Collins attended the birth and confirmed what I had feared from the moment I first saw them. Both boys bear the unmistakable mark of mixed heritage. Their features, their coloring, the texture of their hair, all provide incontrovertible evidence that these are not my biological sons, but rather the offspring of Cora's relationship with the Mexican laborer I employed last summer. She has confessed the truth under questioning, claiming it was a moment of weakness that she immediately regretted. But the damage is done. These boys represent living proof of her infidelity and, more importantly, living threats to my reputation, my business relationships, and Piper's prospects for respectable marriage." The revelation explained everything. Samuel had imprisoned his wife's sons not because of any defect or disability in the boys themselves, but because their existence exposed adultery that would have destroyed the Holloway family's social standing in a community where reputation was everything and racial mixing was considered shameful beyond redemption. In the rigidly hierarchical society of 1850s Nevada territory, where Mexican laborers occupied the lowest social tier and where questions of racial purity obsessed the white settler population, the twins represented a scandal that would have made the Holloway family social pariahs. Subsequent journal entries detailed Samuel's decision-making process with the cold logic of a merchant calculating costs and benefits. He had considered various options, including placing the boys with a Mexican family, abandoning them at an orphanage, or arranging for them to disappear entirely through methods he never specified explicitly. But each option carried risks of exposure, either through the boys eventually learning their origins and making claims against the family, or through witnesses who might connect the Holloway family to the disposal of unwanted infants. The solution Samuel had devised was to hide the boys in plain sight, constructing the attic prison where they could be maintained indefinitely, while remaining completely invisible to everyone except the small circle of paid conspirators who helped manage the secret. The plan had a brutal elegance that appealed to Samuel's systematic nature. The boys would exist but not exist, alive but erased from all records, dependent on their captor for survival, but unable to ever threaten his carefully constructed public identity. March 30, 1852. Construction of the upper containment space is complete. The carpenter I hired believes he was building additional storage area and suspects nothing of the true purpose. The space is adequately sized for 2 young boys and can be secured from below with locks that cannot be defeated from inside. Ventilation is minimal but sufficient to prevent suffocation. I have installed a water delivery system and waste removal arrangements that will allow for basic sanitation without requiring constant supervision. The journal revealed that Samuel had approached the imprisonment with the same methodical planning he applied to his business ventures. He had researched nutrition requirements to determine minimum food provisions that would keep the boys alive without wasting resources on comfort or pleasure. He had consulted medical texts to understand health risks and preventative measures. He had even considered the psychological aspects of prolonged isolation, though his concern was focused on preventing behavioral problems that might complicate management rather than on the suffering his sons would endure. Dr. Collins had been recruited through a combination of financial incentives and carefully calibrated pressure. Samuel's journal described how he had discovered that the doctor owed gambling debts to dangerous creditors in San Francisco, obligations that threatened both his medical practice and his physical safety. Samuel had offered to settle these debts in exchange for the doctor's absolute discretion and ongoing medical care for the imprisoned twins. The arrangement had been formalized through written contracts that implicated Dr. Collins in the conspiracy and ensured his continued cooperation through mutual legal jeopardy. The letters found in the satchel revealed that Samuel had corresponded with other men facing similar situations, though the careful language of these communications avoided explicit descriptions of what was being discussed. References to managing embarrassing situations, maintaining social standing despite domestic complications, and solutions for problems that required permanent discretion suggested a network of men who shared information about hiding shameful family secrets. One letter from a merchant in Sacramento described facilities he had constructed for managing similar challenges, offering advice on ventilation systems, security measures, and techniques for maintaining long-term concealment. Another letter from a rancher in Arizona Territory discussed the psychological challenges of maintaining such arrangements over extended periods, noting the difficulty of reconciling necessary actions with natural paternal feelings that occasionally surfaced despite rational understanding of why such measures were required. The daguerreotype photographs were the most disturbing evidence discovered in the hidden satchel. Samuel had documented the twins' imprisonment through a series of images taken at yearly intervals, creating a visual record of their physical deterioration and psychological damage. The earliest photographs showed 2 infants who appeared healthy and normal, despite the cramped conditions of their attic prison. But subsequent images revealed the progressive effects of malnutrition, lack of sunlight, and complete social isolation. By age 5, the twins appeared gaunt and pale, their bodies showing the stunted growth that resulted from inadequate nutrition and no physical activity beyond the limited movement possible in their confined space. Their eyes held an emptiness that suggested profound psychological damage, the absence of normal childhood curiosity and engagement with the world. They stared at the camera with expressions that combined fear, confusion, and a heartbreaking resignation that no person so young should ever develop. The final photographs taken in 1859, when the boys were 7 years old, showed them as barely recognizable as human beings. Their bodies were skeletal, their skin marked with sores and rashes from the filthy conditions of their imprisonment. Their hair had grown long and matted, never having been properly cut or maintained. But most disturbing were their faces, which showed not fear or sadness but rather a complete absence of emotion, as though the prolonged suffering had burned away their capacity to feel anything at all. Sheriff Malone had to stop reading the journal multiple times, stepping outside to breathe fresh air and regain his composure before continuing. He had seen terrible things during his years as a lawman, violence and cruelty that tested his faith in human decency. But this systematic torture of helpless boys by their own father, documented with bureaucratic precision and justified through twisted logic about reputation and social standing, represented a category of evil that challenged his ability to maintain professional detachment. The journal's final entries, written in late 1859, revealed Samuel's growing anxiety about the sustainability of his arrangement. Dr. Collins's threat to withdraw his cooperation had created a crisis that required decisive action. The boys were dying anyway, their bodies unable to withstand another winter in the unheated attic. Samuel had calculated that allowing them to die from neglect was the simplest solution, one that would eliminate the problem without requiring direct action that might trouble his conscience. December 3, 1859. Dr. Collins has proven unreliable and cannot be trusted to maintain necessary discretion indefinitely. The subjects are in terminal decline regardless of any intervention. The most prudent course is to relocate to California and allow nature to take its inevitable course. Once sufficient time has passed, the property can be sold remotely, and any discovery of remains will be impossible to connect to our family. Cora objects to this plan, but understands there are no alternatives that don't expose us to catastrophic consequences. The journal ended with that entry. Within 2 weeks, the Holloway family had departed Nevada territory, leaving behind 2 dying boys locked in an attic with no food, no water, and no possibility of escape or rescue. Samuel had effectively murdered his sons through abandonment, calculating that their bodies would decompose unnoticed in the sealed space until the estate eventually changed hands and the new owners had no connection to the crimes that had been committed there. But Samuel's calculations had failed to account for one variable: the curiosity and moral conscience of a carpenter who would accidentally break through the sealed attic and refuse to ignore what he had discovered. The secret that was supposed to remain buried forever had been exposed, and now the question became whether justice could be obtained for 2 boys who had never been allowed to exist in any official capacity. The systematic nature of Samuel Holloway's crimes became increasingly clear as Sheriff Malone and his deputies pieced together evidence from multiple sources. This had not been a crime of passion or a momentary lapse in judgment, but rather a carefully planned program of imprisonment and torture that spanned nearly 8 years and involved multiple conspirators who had profited from maintaining a secret that destroyed 2 innocent lives. The investigation revealed that Samuel had begun planning the attic prison months before the twins were born, suggesting he had suspected or known about Cora's pregnancy and had immediately started developing solutions for the problem it represented. Lumber orders placed in December 1851 included specifications for the kind of reinforced flooring and concealed access hatches that would later characterize the prison space. Hardware purchases from a supplier in San Francisco included locks, chains, and restraining devices that served no obvious purpose in normal household construction. Samuel had even consulted with a carpenter visiting from Sacramento who had experience with what he called secure storage facilities, though the actual nature of these facilities was never explicitly discussed in the correspondence that survived. The carpenter, a man named Jasper Holt, had provided detailed plans for ventilation systems that would prevent suffocation while remaining invisible from outside the structure, and for acoustic insulation that would prevent sounds from the imprisoned occupants from being heard by anyone in the rooms below. The financial records revealed the true cost of Samuel's secret. Beyond the initial construction expenses and Dr. Collins's monthly fees, there were regular payments to a woman named Julia Patterson, who had served as the primary caretaker for the imprisoned twins. Julia had been hired ostensibly as a household servant, but her actual duties involved delivering food and water to the attic prison, removing waste, and occasionally providing minimal interaction with the boys to prevent complete psychological collapse. Sheriff Malone located Julia Patterson living in a modest boarding house in the nearby settlement of Silver Springs, working as a seamstress, and trying to forget the years she had spent as an unwilling participant in the Holloway family's crimes. Her testimony, given reluctantly and only after assurances that she would not face criminal charges for her cooperation, provided the most detailed account of what life had been like for the Raymond twins during their imprisonment. Julia described climbing the ladder to the attic space twice daily, morning and evening, carrying buckets of water and plates of food that were passed through a small opening that could be secured from outside. She had never been allowed to enter the attic itself, only to hand supplies through the gap and retrieve the waste bucket that was passed back. The boys had learned quickly not to speak to her or to make any noise that might attract attention, having apparently been severely punished early in their imprisonment for any sounds that carried beyond their confined space. The food she delivered had been basic but adequate for survival: hard biscuits, dried meat, occasional vegetables, and clean water. Samuel had calculated portions based on minimum caloric requirements rather than on what would be needed for healthy growth and development. The result was that the twins remained alive but chronically malnourished, their bodies never receiving the nutrition necessary for normal physical development or cognitive function. On Nouse. Julia testified that she had tried to provide small comforts when possible, occasionally smuggling extra food or warmer blankets during winter months when the attic became bitterly cold. But her efforts were limited by fear of Samuel discovering her compassion and either dismissing her from employment or, worse, deciding that she knew too much to be allowed to leave the household with her knowledge intact. The implicit threat of violence had kept her compliant, even as she watched two young boys deteriorate under conditions that no living creature should endure. The psychological methodology Samuel had employed was as cruel as the physical conditions. The twins had been kept in complete darkness, except during the brief moments when Julia opened the access panel to deliver supplies. They had no books, no toys, no stimulation of any kind, beyond the drawings they scratched into the wooden walls with whatever implements they could improvise. They had been forbidden from speaking loudly enough to be heard beyond their prison, creating an environment of enforced silence that prevented them from even communicating freely with each other. Dr. Collins's medical notes revealed that he had warned Samuel repeatedly about the psychological damage being inflicted on the boys. The doctor had documented symptoms of severe depression, anxiety, and developmental delays that were direct consequences of their isolation and deprivation. He had noted that both twins showed signs of what he called profound melancholy and withdrawal from reality, retreating into internal worlds because the external world offered them nothing but suffering. But Samuel had dismissed these concerns as irrelevant to his primary objective, which was maintaining absolute secrecy regardless of the cost to his imprisoned sons. The journal entries showed that he had convinced himself the twins were not truly his children, and therefore deserved no paternal consideration or natural affection. He had reframed their imprisonment as a necessary business decision rather than a moral choice, applying the same cost-benefit analysis he used in his commercial ventures to the question of how to manage two boys whose existence threatened his reputation. The letters Samuel had exchanged with other men facing similar situations revealed a shared ideology that justified extreme measures to protect family honor and social standing. These men had created an informal network that shared information about concealment techniques, legal strategies for avoiding official documentation of unwanted offspring, and methods for managing the psychological burden of maintaining such secrets over extended periods. One particularly disturbing letter from a correspondent in Texas discussed the challenge of maintaining emotional detachment from subjects who might occasionally evoke natural paternal feelings despite their status as problems requiring management. The letter writer recommended focusing on the threat these individuals represented, rather than on their inherent humanity, a cognitive strategy designed to eliminate guilt and enable continued harsh treatment without psychological distress for the captor. Sheriff Malone realized he was documenting not just a single family's crimes but evidence of a broader social phenomenon that remained largely hidden because the victims were people who had been systematically erased from legal existence and public awareness. The twins had been imprisoned not because they had done anything wrong, but because their father valued his reputation more than their lives, and because frontier society provided the perfect environment for such crimes to remain concealed behind walls of wealth, influence, and coordinated silence from paid conspirators. The question now became whether Samuel Holloway could be located and brought to justice for his crimes, or whether he had successfully escaped beyond the reach of territorial law enforcement by fleeing to California or beyond. The investigation would need to expand across state and territorial boundaries, requiring cooperation from law enforcement agencies that had limited resources and often competing priorities that made interstate criminal cases difficult to pursue effectively. The Territorial Marshal's Office in Carson City received Sheriff Malone's formal request for assistance on September 18, 1862, initiating an investigation that would eventually span 3 states and reveal connections between the Holloway case and similar crimes that suggested a disturbing pattern of family-based imprisonment operating throughout the American West. Marshal Declan Harmon assigned 2 of his most experienced deputies to assist with tracing the Holloway family's movements after they departed Nevada Territory in December 1859. The investigation faced immediate challenges rooted in the chaos of the era. The nation was embroiled in civil war that had disrupted normal government functions and strained law enforcement resources across the country. Population movements had accelerated as people fled war zones or took advantage of opportunities created by military mobilization and economic disruption. Record-keeping systems that were already inadequate in peacetime had become even less reliable as clerks and officials left their posts for military service or relocated to safer territories. But Marshal Harmon had built a career on patient detective work and careful cultivation of information sources throughout the Western Territories. He began by circulating descriptions of the Holloway family to law enforcement agencies in California, Oregon, and the New Mexico Territory, along with summaries of the crimes they were wanted for and requests that any information about their whereabouts be reported immediately to his office. The first substantial lead came from a banker in Sacramento who recognized Samuel Holloway's description and remembered conducting business with a man using that name in early 1860. The banker, Wesley Ford, recalled that Holloway had opened accounts and established business relationships claiming to be a merchant relocating from Nevada Territory to take advantage of California's growing economy. Ford had found Holloway to be knowledgeable and well capitalized, exactly the kind of customer that banks valued during the turbulent economic conditions of the era. But Ford also remembered something that had struck him as unusual at the time. Holloway had been accompanied by a woman and a young adult female who were introduced as his wife and daughter, but the family dynamic had seemed strained and artificial. The wife had appeared withdrawn and unhappy, rarely speaking, and showing none of the excitement one would expect from someone beginning a new life in prosperous California. The daughter had seemed anxious and uncomfortable, frequently glancing at her father as though seeking approval or fearing disapproval for some unspecified transgression. Marshal Harmon traveled to Sacramento personally to interview Ford and examine the banking records associated with Samuel Holloway's California accounts. The financial documentation revealed that Holloway had indeed established himself in Sacramento, investing in commercial properties and resuming the merchant activities that had made him prosperous in Nevada Territory. He had maintained accounts with regular deposits and withdrawals, consistent with successful business operations from January 1860 through August 1861. But in September 1861, all activity had ceased abruptly. The accounts had been closed through written instructions sent from an address in San Francisco, and the funds had been transferred to a bank whose records showed they had been immediately withdrawn in cash. Samuel Holloway had disappeared again, liquidating his California assets and departing without explanation or forwarding address, leaving behind business relationships and property leases that suggested no intention of leaving permanently. The investigation expanded to San Francisco, where Marshal Harmon discovered records suggesting the Holloway family had booked passage on a merchant vessel departing for the Oregon Territory in October 1861. Ship manifests listed Samuel Holloway, his wife Catherine, and his daughter Emma, names that didn't match the family members who had departed Nevada Territory, but which investigators believed were aliases adopted to complicate any efforts to trace their movements. Portland law enforcement confirmed that a family matching the Holloway description had resided in that city from late 1861 through spring 1862, living quietly and avoiding the kind of social engagement that had characterized Samuel's behavior in Nevada and California. Neighbors remembered them as a reserved family that kept to themselves, with the wife rarely leaving their rented house and the daughter appearing pale and unwell whenever she was glimpsed in public. But more significant than simply tracing the Holloway family's movements was the discovery that Samuel had been corresponding with men in multiple Western cities who appeared to be facing similar situations involving family secrets that required careful management. Letters discovered through search warrants executed at addresses where Samuel had lived revealed an active network of communication between men who shared information about concealment strategies, legal procedures for avoiding official documentation, and solutions for problems that required permanent discretion. One letter from a rancher in Arizona Territory, Reed Palmer, discussed facilities he had constructed on his remote property for managing what he called hereditary complications that threatened family reputation. Another, from a mine owner in Colorado, Eric Sutton, described techniques for maintaining long-term concealment of individuals whose existence needed to remain unknown to legal authorities and social acquaintances. A third, from a merchant in New Mexico Territory, referenced difficulties managing subjects who had reached ages where physical containment became more challenging and alternative solutions might need to be considered. Marshall Harmon realized the investigation had uncovered evidence of multiple families operating similar imprisonment schemes throughout the Western Territories, though the exact number of victims and locations remained unclear. The letters used coded language that avoided explicit descriptions of criminal activities, but the context made their meaning unmistakable to investigators who understood what they were looking for. The network appeared to be informal rather than organized, consisting of men who had independently developed similar solutions to similar problems, and then discovered each other through cautious inquiries and gradually escalating exchanges of information. They shared a common ideology that prioritized family reputation and social standing above all other considerations, including the well-being and even the lives of their own offspring who threatened to expose shameful secrets. But the investigation also revealed something more disturbing. Several of the men whose correspondence had been discovered were prominent citizens in their communities, respected businessmen and civic leaders whose public personas showed no hint of the crimes they were committing behind closed doors. They had successfully compartmentalized their identities, maintaining respectable public lives while secretly imprisoning or eliminating family members who didn't fit the image they wished to project. The scope of the crimes extended far beyond what Sheriff Malone had initially discovered in the Holloway attic. Marshall Harmon estimated that based on the correspondence and financial records he had examined, at least a dozen families were actively maintaining similar concealment operations throughout the Western Territories, with an unknown number of victims suffering under conditions comparable to what the Raymond twins had endured. But pursuing these cases presented enormous challenges. The victims had been systematically erased from official records, making it difficult to prove they had ever existed. The perpetrators were wealthy and influential men who could afford expensive legal representation and who had cultivated relationships with local officials who might be reluctant to pursue investigations that implicated respected community members. The witnesses were either paid conspirators who had financial incentives to remain silent, or family members who feared social destruction if the truth became public knowledge. Marshall Harmon made the difficult decision to prioritize locating Samuel Holloway while documenting evidence about the broader network for potential future prosecutions. But he understood that even if Holloway was captured and convicted, many other families would continue operating their imprisonment schemes without interference from law enforcement agencies that lacked resources, jurisdiction, or political will to pursue cases that challenged fundamental assumptions about parental authority and family privacy. The breakthrough in locating Samuel Holloway came from an unexpected source in March of 1863, 6 months after the discovery of the twins' remains in the Dusty Creek attic. A journalist named Damian Fuller, writing for the Sacramento Union newspaper, had been investigating financial irregularities in land transactions throughout California and had stumbled upon property records that connected Samuel Holloway to a series of purchases made under various assumed names in the coastal regions north of San Francisco. Fuller had developed a reputation for investigative reporting that exposed corruption and fraud in the chaotic business environment of Gold Rush, California, where fortunes were made and lost with dizzying speed, and where legal oversight was minimal at best. His methodology involved painstaking examination of property records, business licenses, and financial transactions, looking for patterns that suggested illegal activity or identity fraud. The Holloway case had caught his attention when he noticed that several properties purchased by different individuals shared identical handwriting in their deed signatures, suggesting a single person operating under multiple false identities. The journalist contacted Marshall Harmon with his findings, providing documentation that traced Samuel Holloway's movements through a series of aliases and property transactions that painted a picture of a man desperately trying to establish a new life while remaining invisible to anyone who might be searching for him. The properties were located in remote coastal areas where isolation was easy to maintain, and where questions about a family's background were considered impolite intrusions into private affairs that frontier society generally respected. But Fuller's investigation had revealed something more disturbing than simple identity fraud. Several of the properties Samuel had purchased included structures described in architectural plans as having specialized storage facilities or secure containment areas, terminology that suggested Samuel might be continuing the same patterns of imprisonment that had characterized his years in Nevada Territory. The descriptions were vague enough to avoid attracting official scrutiny, but specific enough that someone familiar with the Holloway case could recognize their likely true purpose. Marshal Harmon organized a coordinated operation involving territorial marshals from Nevada and California, along with local law enforcement from Mendocino County, where the most recent property purchase had been recorded. The expedition departed Sacramento on March 28, 1863, traveling north along rough coastal roads that wound through towering redwood forests and alongside cliffs, where the Pacific Ocean crashed against rocky shores far below. The property Samuel had purchased under the name William Morrison was located 15 miles north of the settlement of Fort Bragg, accessible only by a narrow wagon trail that climbed through dense forest before emerging onto a windswept plateau overlooking the ocean. The isolation was absolute, with no neighboring properties within several miles and no regular traffic along the primitive road that connected the property to the nearest town. The main structure was a substantial two-story house built from redwood timber, constructed within the past year according to local builders who had been hired for the work, but the architectural plans that Fuller had obtained from county records showed that the house included a basement level that was unusually large and elaborately secured, with multiple locked doors, reinforced walls, and ventilation systems that seemed excessive for normal storage purposes. The raiding party arrived at dawn on April 2, 1863, surrounding the property before announcing their presence to ensure that no one inside could flee or destroy evidence. Marshal Harmon led the entry team that approached the front door with weapons drawn, prepared for violent resistance from a man who had already demonstrated his willingness to commit terrible crimes to protect his secrets. Samuel Holloway answered the door with surprising calm, as though he had been expecting this moment and had already resigned himself to its inevitability. He was 46 years old, his face weathered by years of frontier life but still showing the intelligence and determination that had made him a successful merchant. His eyes held no remorse or shame, only a calculating assessment of the situation and the legal challenges he would face. Cora Holloway was found in an upstairs bedroom, her physical condition suggesting years of declining health and profound psychological damage. She appeared decades older than her actual age of 43, her face gaunt, and her eyes holding a haunted expression that came from living with unbearable guilt and complicity in crimes that had destroyed her soul along with her son's. She offered no resistance to the marshals and seemed almost relieved that the years of running and hiding had finally ended. Piper Holloway, now 21 years old, was discovered in another upstairs room, her condition even more disturbing than her mother's. She appeared severely malnourished and showed signs of having been restrained for extended periods, her wrists bearing scars consistent with shackles or ropes. When questioned by female members of the raiding party, she revealed that after the family had fled Nevada Territory, her father had become increasingly paranoid about anyone discovering their secrets, and had eventually begun restricting her movements and communications to ensure she could never reveal what had happened to her half-brothers. But the most significant discovery came when Marshal Harmon and his deputies descended into the basement level that Samuel had constructed beneath the California house. The space was divided into multiple rooms, each secured with heavy doors and elaborate locking mechanisms that could only be operated from the outside. The largest room measured approximately 20 feet by 15 feet, and contained evidence that it had been designed to serve the same purpose as the attic prison in Nevada Territory. The room was currently empty, but its features told a story that made Marshal Harmon's blood run cold. Restraining devices were bolted to the walls at heights appropriate for securing people of various ages. A primitive sanitation system suggested the room was intended for long-term human habitation. Ventilation ducts connected to the surface through concealed openings that would be invisible from outside the structure. Most disturbing were the scratch marks covering portions of the wooden walls, marks that appeared fresh and recently made, suggesting the room had been occupied within the recent past. When confronted with this evidence, Samuel initially refused to answer questions, invoking his legal right to remain silent until he could consult with an attorney. But Cora, broken by years of guilt and suffering, revealed the truth that Samuel had tried desperately to conceal. After abandoning the twins in Nevada territory, Samuel had become obsessed with the idea that his crimes would be discovered and that his family would face social destruction and legal prosecution. His paranoia had grown over the years, fed by news reports about criminal investigations and by his own guilty conscience that manifested as constant fear of exposure. He had begun to view Piper as a threat to his security, someone who knew what had happened to the twins and who might eventually reveal the truth either deliberately or accidentally. His solution had been to gradually restrict her freedom, first through subtle controls over her social interactions and movements, then through increasingly overt imprisonment that transformed her from a daughter into another victim of his obsessive need to maintain absolute control over everyone who knew his secrets. Cora testified that Samuel had been preparing to imprison Piper permanently in the basement room, having concluded that she could never be trusted to remain silent about the family's history. He had been gathering supplies and finalizing preparations when the marshals arrived, perhaps only days away from locking his own daughter into the same kind of prison where her half-brothers had died years earlier. The investigation of the California property revealed additional evidence that connected Samuel to the broader network of men who were operating similar concealment operations throughout the Western Territories. Correspondence discovered in Samuel's study showed ongoing communication with at least 8 individuals who were sharing information about security measures, legal strategies for avoiding prosecution, and techniques for managing what they euphemistically called difficult family situations. One letter from the Arizona rancher Reed Palmer discussed recent challenges he had faced when local authorities had begun asking questions about children who had been born on his property but who never appeared in school enrollments or other public records. Palmer had successfully deflected the inquiry by claiming the children had been sent to live with relatives in Texas, but the incident had made him more cautious about maintaining appropriate documentation that would support his cover story if questions arose again in the future. Another letter from the Colorado mine owner Eric Sutton described modifications he had made to his concealment facilities after one of his imprisoned subjects had managed to create enough noise to attract the attention of mine workers who had been operating near the hidden chambers. Sutton had installed additional soundproofing and had relocated the entrance to a more secure location where the risk of accidental discovery was minimized. These letters demonstrated that the network of family-based imprisonment was not only continuing but evolving, with participants learning from each other's experiences and adapting their methods to address security challenges and reduce the risk of exposure. The men involved showed no indication that they felt remorse for their actions, or that they questioned the fundamental morality of imprisoning and torturing their own family members. Instead, they discussed their crimes with the same matter-of-fact tone they might use for any challenging business problem that required practical solutions. Marshal Harmon realized that arresting Samuel Holloway, while satisfying in terms of obtaining justice for the Raymond twins, would not address the broader network of ongoing crimes that the investigation had exposed. But pursuing cases against the other families involved presented enormous challenges. The letters carefully avoided explicit admissions of criminal activity, using coded language that would be difficult to present as evidence in court. The families involved were wealthy and influential, capable of hiring expensive legal representation and exerting political pressure on law enforcement agencies that might threaten their interests. PESAs, more fundamentally, the legal framework of the era, provided few tools for prosecuting crimes that occurred within families and behind closed doors. Parental authority was considered nearly absolute, with few legal limits on how parents could treat their own offspring. The concept of human rights for imprisoned individuals was poorly developed, and the idea that parents could be held criminally responsible for abusing or even killing their own progeny was not universally accepted in legal circles. The investigation had also revealed that some local officials in various territories had been aware of suspicious circumstances involving prominent families, but had chosen not to pursue investigations that would implicate respected community members. The corruption wasn't always financial. Sometimes it took the form of willful blindness motivated by the desire to maintain social harmony and avoid scandals that might damage entire communities' reputations. Marshal Harmon made detailed reports to territorial governors and federal officials about the network he had discovered, recommending coordinated investigations that would address the full scope of family-based imprisonment operations throughout the Western Territories. But his recommendations met with mixed responses, ranging from genuine concern to dismissive skepticism about whether the problem was as widespread as he claimed. Some officials argued that pursuing these cases would require resources that were desperately needed for more pressing concerns, including the ongoing Civil War and the challenges of maintaining basic law and order in rapidly growing frontier communities. Others suggested that family matters should be handled through social pressure and community intervention, rather than through criminal prosecution that might set dangerous precedents about government interference in private domestic affairs. The response demonstrated a fundamental truth about crimes that occurred within families and behind closed doors. They were often invisible to institutions designed to protect citizens from harm, and even when they were discovered, there was often reluctance to treat them with the same seriousness as crimes committed by strangers in public spaces. The victims of family-based violence and imprisonment were among the most vulnerable people in society, yet they were also among the least likely to receive justice or protection from authorities who preferred to maintain comfortable fictions about family life, rather than confronting ugly realities that challenged those fictions. But the publicity surrounding the Holloway case did have some positive effects. Newspaper coverage of the discovery in the Dusty Creek attic and the subsequent investigation into Samuel's crimes raised public awareness about the possibility that such abuses might be occurring in other families. Some communities began asking harder questions about children who seemed to disappear from public life, and some officials became more willing to investigate suspicious circumstances that previously would have been dismissed as private family matters. The investigation had also created a documented record of the network's existence and methods, information that future law enforcement officials could use if they encountered similar cases. The letters, journals, and other evidence collected during the investigation of Samuel Holloway and his correspondents provided a template for recognizing the patterns that characterized family-based imprisonment operations, making it more difficult for such crimes to remain completely hidden in the future. Yet Marshal Harmon understood that the victory was partial at best. Samuel Holloway would face trial and likely execution for his crimes, but many other families would continue operating their concealment facilities without interference. The Raymond twins would receive some measure of justice, but countless other victims would remain imprisoned or would die in secret without anyone ever knowing they had existed. The investigation had exposed a problem but had not solved it, and the systemic factors that enabled such crimes to occur and persist remained largely unaddressed. The trial of Samuel Holloway began on June 15, 1863, in the Territorial Courthouse in Carson City, Nevada, where the crimes against the Raymond twins had originally occurred, and where territorial law provided the clearest basis for prosecution. The proceedings attracted enormous public attention, with newspaper correspondents from across the Western Territories and even from eastern cities crowding into the courtroom to witness what many observers considered the most shocking criminal case of the era. The prosecution was led by Territorial Attorney Jeremy Walters, a skilled lawyer who had built his reputation on complex fraud cases, and who understood that securing a conviction would require not just proving what Samuel had done, but overcoming deeply ingrained social attitudes about parental authority and family privacy. Walters had spent months preparing his case, assembling physical evidence, witness testimony, and expert opinions that would demonstrate both the facts of the crimes and their legal significance under territorial statutes. The defense team, led by prominent San Francisco attorney Sean Douglas, adopted a strategy that acknowledged some basic facts about the twins' imprisonment, while arguing that Samuel's actions, though perhaps misguided, did not constitute criminal behavior under existing law. Douglas contended that parents had broad discretion in how they raised their offspring, that the twins had been adequately fed and housed even if the conditions were not ideal, and that Samuel's decision to conceal the boys' existence was a private family matter, rather than a crime against society. The courtroom itself became a theater where fundamental questions about family, authority, and human dignity were debated through the specific details of the Raymond twins' suffering. The musty smell of aged wood mixed with the sharp scent of lamp oil and the accumulated body odor of spectators packed into every available space as testimony unfolded over weeks of proceedings. The sound of the prosecutor's voice alternated with the defense attorney's objections, creating a rhythm punctuated by the judge's gavel striking against his bench to maintain order in a courtroom where emotions ran high and spectators frequently expressed their reactions to particularly disturbing revelations. Julia Patterson's testimony provided the most detailed account of what daily life had been like for the imprisoned twins. She described climbing the ladder to the attic space twice each day for nearly 8 years, passing food and water through the small opening, while avoiding any meaningful interaction with the boys, whose faces she glimpsed only briefly in the dim light that penetrated their prison when the access panel was opened. Her voice shook as she recounted the progressive deterioration she had witnessed, the way the twins' bodies became increasingly gaunt and their eyes increasingly empty as years of isolation destroyed their physical health and psychological well-being. Under cross-examination, defense attorney Douglas attempted to portray Julia as a willing participant in the imprisonment rather than a reluctant witness, suggesting that her testimony was motivated by a desire to avoid criminal prosecution for her own role in the crimes. But Julia's obvious remorse and her detailed knowledge of the daily routines that had sustained the twins' imprisonment made her testimony compelling, despite the defense's efforts to undermine her credibility. Dr. Nathan Collins had died in 1860, but his medical records and the letter he had written to Samuel warning about the twins' declining condition were admitted as evidence over defense objections. The prosecution presented expert medical testimony from other physicians who reviewed Dr. Collins's notes and concluded that the conditions described would inevitably result in severe physical and psychological damage. These experts testified that the malnutrition, lack of sunlight, absence of physical activity, and complete social isolation would have caused permanent developmental harm, even if the twins had somehow survived their imprisonment. The daguerreotype photographs Samuel had taken of the twins at yearly intervals became some of the most powerful evidence presented at trial. The prosecution displayed the images in chronological order, creating a visual narrative of progressive destruction that made spectators gasp and several jury members visibly emotional. The contrast between the relatively healthy infants shown in the earliest photographs and the skeletal, hollow-eyed figures in the later images demonstrated more effectively than words could convey the systematic torture the twins had endured over years of imprisonment. Defense attorney Douglas objected strenuously to the photographs being shown to the jury, arguing that their emotional impact was prejudicial and that they would prevent jurors from making rational judgments based on legal standards rather than visceral reactions to disturbing images. But Judge Cooper Ellis ruled that the photographs were legitimate evidence of the conditions the twins had experienced, and that their impact, however disturbing, was relevant to understanding the nature and severity of the crimes Samuel was charged with committing. Cora Holloway's testimony provided crucial evidence about Samuel's motives and his state of mind during the years when he had imprisoned the twins. She described his obsessive concern with reputation and social standing, his conviction that the twins' mixed-race heritage would destroy the family's position in Nevada Territory society, and his cold calculation that imprisoning the boys indefinitely was preferable to any alternative that might expose the circumstances of their birth. Her testimony was particularly powerful because she acknowledged her own complicity in the crimes, admitting that she had allowed fear and shame to overcome maternal instinct, and that she bore responsibility for failing to protect her sons from their father's cruelty. Under cross-examination, Douglas attempted to portray Cora as an unreliable witness, whose testimony was motivated by bitterness toward her husband and a desire to shift blame for decisions that had been made jointly by both parents. But Cora's obvious suffering and her willingness to accept responsibility for her own failures made her testimony credible, despite the defense's efforts to undermine it. Piper Holloway's appearance at trial shocked spectators who remembered the vibrant young woman she had been before her family's flight from Nevada Territory. She was now frail and withdrawn, showing the psychological damage from years of living with terrible knowledge, and then becoming a victim herself of her father's paranoid efforts to maintain secrecy. Her testimony about how Samuel had gradually transformed from a controlling parent into a captor who had been preparing to imprison her permanently in the California basement demonstrated that his crimes were not isolated incidents but rather expressions of a fundamental personality disorder that viewed other people as objects to be managed rather than as human beings with inherent dignity and rights. The prosecution presented Samuel's journal as evidence of premeditation and systematic planning, reading selected entries that documented his careful consideration of various options before settling on long-term imprisonment as the solution to the problem the twins represented. The clinical language Samuel had used in describing his sons made it clear that he had viewed them as threats to be neutralized rather than as people who deserved his care and protection. Defense attorney Douglas argued that the journal should not be admitted as evidence because it represented private thoughts rather than actions, and that people should not be prosecuted for what they wrote in personal documents intended never to be seen by others. But Judge Ellis ruled that the journal was admissible because it demonstrated Samuel's intent and state of mind, factors that were legally relevant to determining whether his actions constituted criminal behavior. The most dramatic moment in the trial came when the prosecution called Marshal Declan Harmon to testify about the network of families who appeared to be operating similar concealment operations throughout the Western Territories. Harmon described the letters he had discovered connecting Samuel to other men who were imprisoning or eliminating family members, and he presented evidence suggesting that such crimes were far more widespread than anyone had previously suspected. Defense attorney Douglas objected vehemently to this testimony, arguing that it was irrelevant to the specific charges against Samuel and that its only purpose was to prejudice the jury by associating Samuel with other alleged criminals whose guilt had not been established through proper legal proceedings. But Judge Ellis ruled that the testimony was admissible as evidence of Samuel's state of mind and his understanding that his actions were criminal, since the letters showed he was consciously concealing his activities and seeking advice about avoiding detection by law enforcement. The defense presented few witnesses, instead focusing on legal arguments about the scope of parental authority and the lack of clear statutory prohibitions against the specific actions Samuel had taken. Douglas argued that while the conditions in which the twins had been kept might seem harsh by contemporary standards, parents historically had exercised broad discretion in how they raised their offspring, including the authority to impose physical punishment and restrict freedom of movement for disciplinary or protective purposes. The defense also argued that the twins' deaths had resulted from Samuel's decision to abandon them rather than from any direct violent action, and that abandonment, while morally questionable, did not constitute murder under Nevada territorial law as it existed in 1859. Douglas contended that at most, Samuel might be guilty of child neglect or endangerment, offenses that carried far less severe penalties than the murder charges the prosecution was pursuing. Huddled. In his closing argument, Prosecutor Walters rejected the defense's narrow legal interpretation and argued that the jury should consider the totality of Samuel's actions over nearly 8 years of systematic torture. He described how Samuel had deliberately created conditions designed to cause suffering, how he had documented the twins' progressive deterioration without taking any steps to improve their circumstances, and how he had ultimately abandoned them to die slowly from starvation and dehydration in the sealed attic where their bodies had remained undiscovered for 3 years. Walters appealed to the jury's sense of basic human decency, arguing that regardless of technical legal distinctions, everyone understood that what Samuel had done was fundamentally wrong and deserving of the harshest punishment available under law. He reminded jurors that the twins had been completely innocent, that their only crime had been being born in circumstances their father considered shameful, and that they had suffered for years because of Samuel's obsessive concern with reputation and his willingness to sacrifice his own sons to protect his social standing. Defense attorney Douglas, in his closing argument, acknowledged that Samuel's actions might seem cruel but insisted that the law must be applied according to its precise language rather than according to emotional reactions to disturbing facts. He argued that parents had always possessed broad authority over their offspring, and that courts should be extremely reluctant to criminalize parental decisions except in the most extreme circumstances. He suggested that the appropriate response to Samuel's behavior was social condemnation rather than criminal prosecution, and that finding him guilty of murder would set a dangerous precedent that could be used to intrude on legitimate parental authority in future cases. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning a verdict that reflected their horror at what the twins had endured. They found Samuel Holloway guilty on 2 counts of murder in the first degree, rejecting the defense's arguments about parental authority, and accepting the prosecution's contention that systematic torture, followed by deliberate abandonment, constituted intentional killing regardless of technical legal distinctions about direct versus indirect causation. The verdict was met with applause from spectators that Judge Ellis struggled to suppress with his gavel, and with visible relief from Cora and Piper Holloway, who had testified against Samuel despite the personal and social costs of publicly acknowledging their family's crimes. The conviction represented a significant legal precedent, establishing that parental authority had limits, and that parents could be held criminally responsible for extreme abuse of their offspring, even when such abuse occurred in private, and was justified by the parents as necessary for protecting family interests. But the trial had also exposed the limitations of the legal system in addressing crimes that occurred within families, and that involved victims who had been systematically erased from official existence. The conviction had been possible only because construction workers had accidentally discovered the twins' remains, because Samuel had kept detailed records of his crimes, and because some witnesses had been willing to testify despite social pressure to maintain family secrets. In how many other cases, observers wondered, were similar crimes occurring without detection because the victims remained successfully hidden and the perpetrators maintained better operational security than Samuel had managed? Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.